Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo. We're going to take another look at our GetInfo. We're going to add a little bit of additional functionality to our demo here, allow for our user then to interact a little bit more than in the previous examples. This video assumes that you've already attempted to run an executable from the command line and have built your GetInfo project, or rather a GetInfo function. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about its limitations. So right off the bat, everything's hard-coded. It's not terribly interesting. We'd like to make something a little more interactive. We've seen how to print things to the console, but we haven't seen how to retrieve things from the console. And so in this particular video, we're going to focus on how to use a scanner object. And this will probably be one of the first times you will have seen the idea of creating an object from a class or an instance of a class in Java. So this is going to be pretty new to us. It's going to be somewhat similar to what you saw in C, that you have to declare and then initialize something. In this case, it's going to be the scanner object that's going to allow for us then to read data from our system.in. And we've dealt with system.out already, but we've not yet dealt with system.in. And so to begin with, what we want to do is do a little bit of cleanup, maybe a little bit of modification to our code. You would almost agree that GetInfo might not be the best name for this function. And I left it as GetInfo in the earlier videos intentionally so that we could handle it here. And what we'd like to do is a refactor. There's a number of ways that you can do this. A simple Control-H would probably suffice in this particular scenario, but what we want to do instead is we want to take a look at the ability to refactor and then rename. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to change our GetInfo function name to something that probably makes a little more sense, and that would be to DisplayInfo. Now, once again, there is a greater meaning behind this function name, and you'll see that in just a little bit. And then we also want to apply the rename to the comments. And so if you hit refactor, then you'll notice that the function name has changed, and also the places where we call the function has changed, and in some of the comments it has changed, but we haven't handled our switches. And so what we want to do is we want to change now how we handle the switches. So once again here, we're going to do a Control-H. And like I said, arguably in this particular case, this was simple enough that we could have probably gotten away with Control-H, but I wanted you to see the ability in NetBeans to refactor your code. And we'll take a look at that in various videos as we go along. And then let's go ahead and replace all references to the /GetInfo. Go ahead and close this out. Go ahead and build it. We're still successful there. And then what we'll do then is we'll simply just check to make sure that we haven't actually broken anything by simply calling it now with the DisplayInfo switch. Looks good. So far, we've just changed the behavior by changing the switch, but fundamentally our program still works the same. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to add an additional function. This time, we do mean for it to be called GetInfo, because the idea is that we want to retrieve the information from the command line. And so what we'll do here is we'll sneak another function in here. In this case, we're going to go ahead and add our comment block, and we'll come back to the details of that in just a little bit, but we're going to have a public static void, no return value yet. And we're going to call this one GetInfo. And the hopes with this one is going to be that it's going to interactively get the information from the command line. We're going to look at a couple of different variations of this where we can also pass it parametrically. But for right now, what this function is going to do is going to collect the info from the user via prompts. In other words, we're going to ask the user questions, and hopefully he or she will answer them for us. And so in this particular case, again, we have no input arguments. Now, the first object that we are going to need to create to make this work is going to be a scanner object that allows for us to scan our system in other words, to read off of the command line. And so I'll provide you with some links for this, but this is for the version 8 documentation. This is one of our first opportunities to start looking at the Oracle documentation. This is for JDK 18, but it's going to be similar for the older versions as well, and probably also for the newer versions. But you see the idea of creating this new scanner object and passing to it the system.in. In other words, that's where it's going to read the information from. You will see that there's ways to scan different types of objects or different sources, different streams as well. But what we want to do now is we want to create a scanner object, and I'm going to just go ahead and call this one scanner. And I'm going to specify, though, that it needs to be from the java.lang. Whoops, a little bit too quick on the autocomplete there. Java.util, sorry, scanner. And I'm just going to call it scanner. You can use lowercase s if you wish, if it gets too confusing for you. And we're going to specify this is going to be equal to a new java.util.scanner. And we're going to specify that it needs to scan system.in. Now, before we go any further, let's take a second to understand what we've just done here. This is not terribly different from what you would have seen in a C programming class. We have to specify the type. The only thing that's different here is that it has a fully qualified name here. In other words, we're specifying the package that it comes from. And then you specify the name of the variable, and then you're using this keyword new, and new just simply says that I want to create a new object, in this particular case of Java type java.util.scanner. And so this is just a little bit different syntax from what you're familiar with when it comes to your C programming language. If you've worked with other programming languages, you've probably seen the new keyword already. And we'll come back to this. As I said, this just indicates that we're going to be scanning the command line for data, okay, or for strings is ultimately what we're going to be looking for. And the idea is that we're going to capture all of the information that we had hard-coded previously. We're going to simply capture it by a series of prompts. Now, this one's going to get pretty long, so I'm going to get us started on it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to let you finish it off, and then we're going to regroup at the end to make sure that you have a working solution. And so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the exact same information that we got from the user, or attempted to get from the user earlier with our first version of GetInfo that ultimately turned into our DisplayInfo, but regrettably it was all hard-coded. We want this one to be a little more interactive. And so what you want to do now is you simply then prompt the user for their first name. And so to do that, it's once again system.out.println, and you can decide how pleasant you want to be in your prompt. I would encourage you to put something like, please enter the first name, or something along those lines, followed by a colon. You remember you automatically get the new line here. But then what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're actually capturing information from the command line, and we'll ultimately need to store it in a variable. So why don't we go ahead and get started with seeing how this works. And this is going to be, once again, leveraging our java.lang.string that we saw in an earlier video. And this is going to be the fully qualified name. In other words, includes the packages. We could simplify that to just simply string. However, that won't give us a true appreciation of where we are in the framework. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and keep the pattern of first name. And I can do a couple of things here. I can create it as a new string, or I can just simply set it equal to double quotes. But since we're immediately going to use it, then you may argue that you don't even have to initialize it. However, just like in C, I will strongly encourage that we initialize all our variables when we start to use them. And so we can go ahead and anticipate what this is going to look like. Java.lang.string, last name, and so on. At this point, then, what you want to do is you want to leverage that scanner that we just created. So scanner dot And this is going to be the instance of the scanner, not the class, not the static methods. And what you want to do is you want to check to see, in some cases, what the next piece of information is. So in other words, what you can do is you can check to see if it has an integer, has a long, a short, and so on, including bytes. Or what you can do is you can just simply capture then the information from the scanner by just simply specifying next. In other words, in this case, it's very simple. We're not trying to get any integers or doubles. We're just going to accept that whatever the user types in was meant to be a string. And so this is the simplest case of using the scanner. It's the reason that I wanted to start off with this. We're not dealing with any complicated data types or anything like that. And you simply say first name is equal to scanner.next. And that just basically takes whatever the user enters in, puts it into your first name variable, stores it as a string, and calls it done. Now, we're going to repeat this one more time. And we'll go system.out.println. And we can once again provide a pleasant prompt here. Please enter the last name. And then last name. And if you want to, you can hit Control Spacebar to speed things up a little bit if you wish. That's going to be scanner.next. And once again, we have no checking here. A user could enter in, for instance, a number for their first name or the last name. We'll get to validation later on. We're just going to assume that whatever the user entered in is, in fact, what they intended to. Now, we can continue on with this. As a matter of fact, a little bit of creative copying and pasting, starting with our variable declarations. I'm going to go ahead and cheat just a little bit, do a little bit of copying and pasting here. We're going to change this to Blazor ID and our initials. And then likewise, we do the same thing with the prompts. So just a little bit of copying and pasting, and then changing the prompts here. So this is going to be, please enter the Blazor ID, and then please enter the initials. And then change, of course, the variables that you store them in. And hopefully you can start to see the pattern here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here for just a little bit. I encourage you to do the same thing. And I want you to finish then the prompts off as well as the variable declarations for each of the additional pieces of information that we would like to capture from the user. So we'll see you in a couple of seconds. All right, so welcome back. Hopefully you've got code that looks roughly similar to what I have. You'll see that I've added some additional variables up here, languages, goals, class. I chose to do it that way because I can't use spaces in variable names and just instead rely on camel casing. Same with the computer model, computer CPU, and so on. And then I have my prompts, which I've tried to make them a little bit cleaner here, including adding a date here, perhaps just for consistency's sake. I'll use a capital letter D. At this point, we should be ready to try to compile this. Now, I have not run this yet, so I'll be as curious as you are to see how this works. And so at this point, then we have working code, but we aren't actually calling it in our main. And so at this point, what we want to do is we want to think about what do we want to actually have happen? Well, we want to call our GetInfo, and specifically, we want to know to call it whenever we only have a single command line argument. In other words, much like the earlier example, then what we'll do is we'll just put another branch in here of our if, else, if. And so we'll start off here with an else if args dot length equal to 1 and args square bracket 0. And then this time we want to just check to see that it equals ignore case of GetInfo. So in other words, if the user just simply provided the GetInfo switch and nothing else, then they want to run our interactive version of our GetInfo. So I'm going to run GetInfo. And once again, we're going to use the full name here using the EE333 package and our fundamentals demo.getInfo. Now, let's go ahead and build it once more. And let's go ahead and run through it, make sure that we don't have any mistakes in our prompts. You can actually borrow, if you would, this text file. We can open it up, for instance, in Notepad in addition to in NetBeans, and you can just do a little bit of copying and pasting, or you can just work your way through it with typing it. We can also use a batch file, but let's give it a shot to see how this works. And so there we go. We're prompted by entering the first name for the first few. I think I can handle these. So Gregory Myers, my Blazer ID, and then my initials, and then the languages. I'm just going to start copying and pasting from the text file. You'll notice here that I accidentally skipped past a few. I think I might have grabbed too many characters in my text file, so you want to be careful of that. We'll go ahead and stop this and run it one more time. I may be forced to just do all of these manually, which is not a big deal. And so my Blazer ID, my initials, and then I'm just going to keep this brief. I'm just going to start with C in MATLAB. Seems like I do have a problem here because I'm skipping straight over my class. So let's go back and take into my class. So let's go back and take a look real quick at what's actually going on. And so if you come back here, you'll notice that I have a scanner dot next for my languages. And what it is doing is it is only scanning the first string. So in other words, it's recognizing that the space separates the string. So how are we going to get around that? Now, the first time when I did this, I copied and pasted, I think I had a new line in there that I didn't mean to have. But let's see how we would do this to avoid skipping or avoid then passing more than one string at a time. Well, just like we did with our command line arguments, we could, for instance, put quotes around it, and then you'll see that once again, it is skipping to our next one. So we have our date there. So in other words, we went from the date, we've skipped over the date, and now we are on the computer model. So basically, every time we try to pass something with a quote in it, or excuse me, with a space in it, it breaks it up and it uses each string as a separate string. In other words, each chunk of data then becomes a separate string. That's not the behavior that we want. So to help you understand a little better about what's going on, let's go back to our scanner documentation. And so you'll see here's the class. But if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see then you can actually look at some of the methods and better explanation of what you possibly find in NetBeans. And you'll see then when we selected our next, we probably were a little bit careless. And you'll see that it says finds and returns the next complete token from this scanner. Well, token is essentially means data separated by spaces. And so what's happening is whenever our data has spaces in it, it's going to separate those out as separate tokens. And so if you scroll down just a little further, you should see then the ability to do an entire line. And that is advances the scanner past the current line and returns the input that was skipped. So the idea is that we would want to capture the entire line of data as a single string. So what we're going to do is we're going to carefully go back in, and we'll simply make sure that we are actually capturing our next line. And note here that it is a capital L. All right. And so each one of these then, and you can do a find and replace if you'd like, perfectly fine. I'm just going to accidentally deleted there. All right. So what we'll do here is we'll just simply do a find and replace here. And this gets you an idea of the difference then between the next and our next line. And so we will be using our next and its sister functions, or however you want to go about looking at that, is that you have a number of them to get other data types as well. Next just simply gets the next string, and the next line gets the entire line as a single string. And then let's rerun this one more time, and let's see if we fixed our problem. All right, so there we go. So far, so good. And then, as I said, the first time you want to be real careful with your copying and pasting, but this time I'm going to try not to capture the new line out of my text document, which you'll see that now it reads all of those as a single value. And then we can just simply go through the rest of the file, but you'll notice that we're not skipping or sticking tokens into the later variables, and then so on. I'm just going through this text file once again to troubleshoot our function. And then the last two are going to be the processor and the memory. So at least this time around, we got the behavior that we expected. In other words, one line of data corresponds to each string. However, we didn't really do anything with it. So if anything, this is still somewhat of a disappointment. So what we'd like to do now is we'd like to figure out how can we display the information that we have captured from the user. Well, the easiest thing to do would be to just go down here in our GetInfo function and simply insert a bunch of system.out.println. And then every time we needed those, then we would just simply have to add more and more print lines. Okay. However, that is not very reusable. And so in the spirit of reusing our code, what we'd like to do now is we'd like to create a version of our DisplayInfo that will accept additional pieces of information. And so we're sort of getting two lessons here. One is we're getting a lesson on code reuse, but we're also getting a lesson on how we can overload functions, meaning that we can have multiple display infos. And this one's going to get a little long, so we may break it up on multiple lines, but we'll start off, we'll have a public static void display info, but the difference being with this one is it will actually accept input arguments. And what we can do here is we can start off with java.lang.string, and the first input argument that it would accept is going to be the first name, and then java.lang.string last name. And I'm going to go ahead and complete the curly braces so that we don't have as much difficulty typing here. But what we can also do is we can actually go ahead and extend this onto multiple lines here, because Java will allow for us to do that. And then just simply add the additional arguments to our function. So our Blazor ID, just remember to use your commas here. Our initials. We have our languages, which we could argue could be an array of strings, but we're just going to do it as a singular string. We want to have our goals for the class. We want to have our goals professional, our graduation, our computer model, our computer CPU, and then last but not least, going to be our computer memory. Now, hopefully you've paused me at this point and played a little game of catch up to see if you can do this or see the pattern yourself. I'm just going to clean my function signature up just a little bit. Once again, we have another public static void function, no input arguments, or excuse me, no output arguments, but multiple input arguments. And so we would want to go through and document each of them. I'll put a little note here. But there are going to be no output arguments. And then what we'll do now is inside of this function is where you would have your print statements. And so we're going to go ahead and borrow from our DisplayInfo. And the difference being is instead of hard coding the Gregory this time, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage that variable. Now, before we go any further, just a quick reminder, we're not doing any sort of validation at all. In other words, the user could enter in and possibly pass any sort of nonsense value that we did not intend. So you would want to consider doing things like checking the string length and also to see whether it is null. But we are not going to bother to do that in this particular video. Instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to focus on trying to display the information that was captured from the user. So again, at this point, what I'd like to see you do is simply pause the video and make sure that you understand exactly what needs to be done here. In other words, go ahead and fill out the remainder fields by yourself and then restart the video. Make sure that you understand how to do this. And so I'm going to go do one more. So we have our initials. And then at this point, I'm going to pause for a little bit and I will see you in a couple seconds. All right, welcome back. So you should have something that looks roughly like what I have now. We had completed the input arguments last time around. Hopefully we have enough of them. But we have our print statements now utilizing each one of our variables from our function signature. And additionally, what I've done is I've went ahead and sort of documented our input parameters. You'll notice that if you did not do this, that you had these little warnings next to the line for the input arguments. One of the advantages of breaking up our input arguments on multiple lines is that you can identify which ones you haven't done. You could, of course, have this whole function signature on one line. It would just be one really, really long line. But anyway, we are effectively done. You want to go ahead and build your project. And so far, so good, no errors. But we need to now tie our GetInfo back with our DisplayInfo. In other words, what we want to do is we want to actually be able to pass then our information that we have collected to our DisplayInfo. And so inside of our display or our GetInfo rather, what we want to do now is we want to make a call to our DisplayInfo, not the one that doesn't accept any input arguments, but the one that does. And this is going to be then just a very careful listing of each one of the arguments in their correct order. We're not going to be doing any sort of naming of the arguments here or anything like that. And now we just have to remember what the rest of them are. The first four are pretty easy. It's languages then, and then goals for the class, goals professional, the graduation date, the computer model, computer memory, and at this point, probably logic should dictate that we should span lines here just so we can see this a little bit better. And then computer memory. And so at this point, I'm only spanning the line or breaking it up into multiple lines just for convenience sake so we can see this a little bit better. But now effectively we have one function that collects all the information and then passes it on to a display function. Now, if this was the only time you were trying to display this information, then this would probably be a really bad use of time. However, we will not be doing that. We will actually be using that display function several times, and I want us to see a couple of different varieties of it. So this is a healthy exercise now in being able to pass multiple parameters. The last thing that I want to do is just point out that you are technically getting a warning here because it's not used inside the function. Some warnings are acceptable to ignore, and in this particular case, that warning is acceptable to ignore. All right, so let's go ahead and build it. We're getting no errors. Back to our command line, we're going to go ahead and run our GetInfo. Again, I have not ran this, so we'll be possibly entertained here. I'm going to go ahead and put in my first name. I'm just hitting the up arrow when possible. Enter the last name, Myers, Blazer ID, initials. And at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just borrow my text file. There's my languages, my goals, both personally or for the course and also professional. And again, just a prompt there for the graduation date or semester. If you wanted to put it in that way, that's perfectly fine as well. The CPU, and then the memory. And I just noticed that I probably could clean those last two up a little bit because the user doesn't need to have that much insight into what our variables look like. But more importantly, now you see that we get a printout then in a better format of all of our data. And put another way, basically it matches our template. In other words, we're actually displaying the information that was captured from the user using the scanner. So let's clean this up just a little bit just to match the format that we had earlier. So there's computer model, computer CPU, computer memory. And the other thing that probably wouldn't be a half bad idea to do is just simply have a system.out.println here that puts an empty line in between the last prompt and the last scanner input and then the display. And you could argue that that could be in the DisplayInfo function as well. But essentially, at this point, we are done. Hopefully, you can appreciate what's going on. We are capturing the information in one function. Note it's a static function again, and we are displaying it in a helper function that accepts multiple arguments. Now, before I leave this video, I want to point out that yes, this probably did seem a little bit painful. That was kind of the point. I would want to show that we were passing too many arguments to a function when we could probably find a different approach to do this with. And so if you've taken C already, you know that we have the ability to do it with structures. And then if you dealt with any object-oriented language before, you know that we can deal with this as an object. Now, we'll handle the object solution in a later video, but for now, just recognize that you can capture the information in one function, and then you can turn around and display it in another. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.